For the length of their existence, submarines have inspired terror and paranoia. But for early submariners, the greatest threat wasn't from enemy vessels. The greatest threat was from their own. For nearly 80 years, the depths of the waters off of the Isle of May harbored a secret. Only when divers stumbled upon a wreck was the court-martial for the Battle of May Island released, and only reluctantly, as it constituted one of the most embarrassing and absurd moments in the history of the Royal Navy. In the beginning of the 1900s, naval warfare was undergoing rapid changes. Only 50 years prior, European navies had begun abandoning wooden ships in favor of iron ones, driven by steam engines. And in the intervening decades, admirals theorized and drafted new designs. Their most crucial decision was how they would balance the three key aspects of a warship: speed, armor, and firepower. Increasing any of these would inevitably mean decreasing at least one of the others to accommodate it. However, in the absence of major fleet action, there was no way to properly test the particulars of this new form of naval combat, and so the admirals were forced to speculate about which factors would be most important in an engagement. And in the British Royal Navy, there were few as vocal or certain of their opinions as Sir John Fisher. Fisher had long served as a respected member of the Navy, and by 1904, he was the obvious choice for First Sea Lord, the man who would coordinate the readiness of the entire fleet. Unlike his contemporaries, he had few qualms criticizing the Navy and its policies. Author N.S. Nash describes him so, quote, "Fisher was not a nice chap in the conventional sense. He was a dynamic, tenacious, pugnacious, argumentative, and extrovert character with an absolutely iron determination to have his own way. He was a bully. He was also a sailor's officer, and held views on discipline well ahead of his time. He utterly eschewed the rampant snobbery that beset the Victorian Navy. Fisher had one overriding deficiency. He believed, without equivocation, that he had a monopoly on wisdom. He did not." End quote. Before Fisher, the Royal Navy was an anachronistic combination of wooden-hulled, iron-hulled, and iron-plated ships. Upon his appointment as First Sea Lord, Fisher quickly set to work declaring over 150 ships in the Navy as too weak to fight and too slow to run away. Every wooden-hulled and iron-plated ship was retired, as well as some of the outdated iron-hulled ones. These would be replaced by ships of his own particular specifications. He had spent much of his career specializing in gunnery, and his beliefs followed accordingly. Of the three main aspects of naval vessels, speed, armor, and firepower, he valued speed and firepower first. He believed that if a ship could rapidly position itself and fire a powerful and accurate first volley, then thick armor would be unnecessary, as the enemy would never have a chance to fire back. Therefore, his ships would have high top speeds, and the focus he placed on gunnery during his time gave the British ships accurate and powerful gun turrets. However, this came at a cost. The armor on his ships was so scant that they offered little to no protection from enemy guns. This design philosophy persisted after Fisher retired as First Sea Lord, as he continued to offer his counsel in naval affairs, resulting in ever larger ships with impressive gun batteries and high top speeds with extremely light armor. But beyond the modernization of the fleet, there was another issue that the British Royal Navy was reluctant to address: the progression of a naval technology known as the submarine. While there had already been instances of submersible craft, European navies were rapidly improving upon this concept, having realized their potential impact on naval warfare. While underwater, there was as yet no way to reliably detect a submarine, nor any way to reliably damage one, and so, effectively, a submerged submarine was both invisible and invincible. From periscope depth, they could launch torpedoes from relative safety, or they could surface to fire both torpedoes and deck-mounted guns from advantageous angles. Despite the inevitable dominance of the submarine, the British Royal Navy was notoriously inflexible, and during his 6-year tenure as First Sea Lord, Fisher had refused to allocate funds to the design of long-range submarines, choosing to focus on short-range craft, practical only for coastline defense, and purchasing many of the components and ships rather than constructing them. When World War I began in 1914, the British had few long-range submarines, while the Germans fielded 20 of them and wielded the infrastructure to build many more. Fisher was recalled to serve as First Sea Lord once again late that year at the age of 73, and one of his chief goals was to correct for his lack of preparation by commissioning a new class of long-range submarine. But here, too, the rigidity of the Royal Navy would demand unfavorable compromise. The British and the Germans took opposing opinions on the role of submarines in naval warfare. The Germans believed that submarines worked best as autonomous, independent hunters, and at the outset of the war, they sent their submarines, or U-boats, into hostile waters to sink as many enemy warships as they could. This proved devastating. With no proper options to combat them, the British were entirely unable to prevent or even track German U-boat activity, and some of them inflicted casualties measured in the thousands on a single hunting expedition. Whenever a U-boat was spotted, it would simply crash dive, a maneuver that took, on average, only 30 seconds. The British became so desperate for some way to combat them that they ordered motorboats to patrol for enemy submarines at periscope depth and, upon discovering them, pull the boat alongside them and smash the glass of the periscope with a hammer. Despite the U-boat's brutal attacks, the British Admiralty still believed that the most efficient method of fleet warfare was to engage in a single massive and decisive battle with their superior forces, and therefore, every effort should be made to prepare the Grand Fleet for such an engagement. Their long-range submarine would be designed accordingly. In theory, they would send flotillas of submarines alongside surface ships, and, upon sighting the enemy fleet with scout ships, they would dive and move into a flanking position, where they would strike with guns and torpedoes. The British admirals claimed that this would be simple to implement, and it therefore required little to no preparation. A pre-war mock battle, however, suggested the exact opposite, that executing this maneuver was so difficult and unintuitive that the submarines were more likely to surface into the hull of an Allied ship than inflict any casualties on the enemy. This was proven during the war in actual combat. The British surface ships mistook their submarines for German U-boats and attempted to ram them, while the British submarines fired torpedoes at their own fleet, only narrowly missing them. Nevertheless, the Admiralty refused to change their position. To them, the only proper implementation of submarines was in fleet action. But this introduced a problem. According to British naval doctrine, fleets were to move at a pace of 21 knots, and despite the theorized power of submarines, the admirals were apparently unwilling to slow their fleets to include them. And so, Fisher approached the engineers with one demand in particular: that the new submarines have a maximum speed greater than 20 knots in order to keep pace with the other ships. Typically, submarines would use diesel engines while they were on the surface for greater speed and then use batteries while under the water. However, the British had never developed the means to produce a diesel engine powerful enough to propel a submarine greater than 20 knots, and now that the Great War had begun, it was impossible to commission any from other nations that had such capabilities. The engineers, however, had a solution: steam engines. While the diesel engine was a relatively new technology, steam engines had seen commercial use for nearly 200 years, and there was no question that a submarine with a steam engine could reach speeds well beyond Fisher's demands. The concept had been tested before in a small French submarine, which utilized retractable funnels for the smoke. However, while in enemy territory, a swell had bent her funnel, preventing it from retracting and allowing water from the waves and the rain to pour into the boiler. Immediately, the suggestion seemed outrageous. As author Don Everett put it, instinct and common sense had told Fisher that boilers, funnels, and submarines did not mix. Rather than entertain this idea, Fisher ordered the engineers to devise a way to increase the power of the diesel engines. But while this engine was being designed, the German U-boats were continuing their hunts in Allied waters. Scouting patrols were reporting false positives or identifying them incorrectly. Admirals and engineers were struggling to discover viable countermeasures, and the U-boats only continued to grow more aggressive and more numerous. Mariners grew paranoid, and at one point, rumors began to circulate about a U-boat that had been spotted traveling at 19 knots. In truth, there was no U-boat that could travel at 19 knots, but the Admiralty believed these reports all the same, First Sea Lord Fisher among them. During this time, in early 1915, Germany began its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, destroying ships indiscriminately, including neutral and merchant ships. Then, Fisher received word that the new diesel submarines would only be able to reach 19 knots, too slow to keep pace with the fleet. Believing he had no other option, Fisher returned to the idea of steam-powered submarines, and, reluctantly, he approved the first run of what would be known as the K-class. However, he demanded that they also be fitted with diesel engines as backups. The first K-class submarine would be completed almost a year later in May of 1916. The best submarine captains in the fleet were recalled to command the K-class vessels, and they set about familiarizing themselves with this new craft. However, as they took to these ships, their excitement invariably turned to concern. The most obvious issue was their size. While most submarines were relatively small, the K-class was utterly massive, measuring at 103 meters in length, or 339 feet. This size was necessary to house its bulky steam engine, capable of propelling it to 24 knots, but this also meant that maneuvering was ponderous, and its turns were wide. While this was perhaps expected, the size introduced an unforeseen problem. When nosing down to dive, the deck would act as an extra hydroplane, pushing the submarine down much harder than intended. Nearly, if not every K-class submarine touched the bottom of the ocean with its nose at least once due to this issue, some lodging themselves in the silt while the stern hung helplessly in the air. This issue was addressed partially sometime later when bulbous bows were attached to the front of the vessel. But the K-class's maneuvering problems extended beyond its horizontal movement. Most submarines were capable of crash diving in approximately 30 seconds in case of danger. The K-class, comparatively, took on average over 5 minutes, not only to account for its size, but also to give it time to extinguish its furnaces and retract its smokestacks. The act of diving itself, however, was remarkably dangerous. Due to the brutal heat generated by the steam engine, numerous ventilation funnels were required throughout the ship. While open on the surface, it was common for water to splash into these funnels and spray painfully onto the engineers. In one instance, the ventilator fans sprayed the water so forcefully that it shattered the glass on the gauges. When diving, mushroom caps were supposed to shut these funnels, but these caps often failed to close, whether due to mechanical error, electrical error, human error, or even a piece of ocean debris lodging in the cap. In these cases, water would flood into the hull unimpeded. These were among the myriad other mechanical problems that were discovered and either had to be rectified or simply accepted. However, the longer the ships were docked, the more likely mechanical failure became, and since the Germans refused to engage the Grand Fleet in proper fleet battles, the K-class spent the majority of their time waiting static at port. While these problems alone made fielding the K-class a questionable decision, further design flaws became evident on rough seas. One of the largest problems was entirely foreseen, yet went unprevented. When the swells became large enough, water would pour into the funnels for the steam engines, putting out the furnaces and sometimes causing blowbacks so ferocious that the engineers were burnt to death. This, however, was assuming that the furnaces would stay lit. The K-class submarine utilized a clever method of storing oil for the burners. As oil was siphoned from the tanks, seawater would be let in to fill them, helping to keep the ship at the proper buoyancy. In calm waters, the oil would float on top of the water and work as intended, but in rough seas, these tanks would sometimes be shaken enough to temporarily mix the oil and water, extinguishing the furnaces. On calm seas, if the oil pump wasn't turned off before a dive, then it could flood the boiler room with oil and catch fire, burning the equipment and the people inside, as it did at least once. The oil tanks themselves were embedded directly into the hull, and the top of the tank served also as the floor of the mess hall, but these panels were designed loose enough so that, when under the water and subjected to pressure, black oil would seep up between the seams in the panels, making the floor slick. Even when the ship was running well, working on it was a miserable experience. The furnaces were placed in the center of the ship, and so the only cooler section was the conning tower, but there, living conditions were scarcely better. The K-class was designed to sit high in the water, and when the ship rocked, even those with strong stomachs grew seasick while swaying high in the tower due to its irregular rhythm. Getting up to the conning tower, however, posed its own danger, as when water splashed down onto the control panels, it would ground them and cause the latter to shock anyone who touched it. Typically, to escape the uncomfortable accommodations of submarines, crews would be permitted to rest and live on depot ships while at port, but for those aboard the K-class, no such accommodations were made, as the K-class was designated a self-contained warship. This compounded with the reputation of the K-class for killing its crews, and in response to this stress, the men assigned to these ships regularly became violent with one another, and most turned to alcohol. What's more, the submariners were usually listless and bored, as the vast majority of their time was spent moored. They would occasionally scout for U-boats off of the coast of the British Isles, but in only one instance did a K-class engage an enemy submarine, where she managed to strike her target with a dud torpedo. Despite all of its shortcomings and its litany of failures, the Admiralty was still intent on seeing the K-class submarines used to their fullest potential, and the price of this self-assuredness would be paid not by those in command, but by those serving aboard the vessels themselves. On the evening of January 31st, 1918, a fleet of British ships left the port of Rosyth on the east coast of Britain. That night's goal was simple. The force was to travel through the Firth of Forth into the North Sea. Then, when they had passed north of the Isle of May, they were to change direction and proceed to a predetermined point where they would meet with another force traveling from Scapa Flow to participate in an exercise. Among these ships were 9 K-class submarines, and by now, each sailor aboard them had come to fear their vessel as much as any enemy's, perhaps more. All of the sailors were nervous. Earlier that afternoon, a pilot in a scout plane had spotted a submarine, but before he could approach, the submarine performed a crash dive and disappeared. Out in the open water, the fleet would be a vulnerable target for a German U-boat, and so, extra precautions would be necessary. But there was another cause for the sailors' concern. Of the K-class submarines joining the fleet, one of them was of particular note, K-22. By now, many of the sailors knew that K-22 was not her original designation. She had formerly been known by the particularly unlucky name K-13. What's more, almost a year prior to the day, K-13 had catastrophically failed her trial run and foundered, killing nearly half of her crew. Those who survived were carved out of the hull only barely before they suffocated, and the ship was refitted and rechristened as K-22. According to naval superstition, a rechristened ship can only be unluckier than it once was. As if to make matters worse, the ship was assigned to the 13th submarine flotilla. To the crew, a ship rechristened from K-13 traveling with the 13th submarine flotilla on the anniversary of her fatal accident felt like tempting fate. The force from Rosyth was divided into 5 groups traveling in one long single-file line stretching for over 15 nautical miles, with each group leaving approximately 15 minutes after the one ahead of it. Out ahead, the flagship Courageous led the way on her own. Close behind was the 13th submarine flotilla, led by the Marksman-class flotilla leader Ethereal, which was to command and coordinate the 5 K-class submarines behind her: K-11, K-17, K-14, K-12, and finally, the rechristened K-22. Behind them, the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron followed, consisting of 4 large cruisers: the Australia, the New Zealand, the Indomitable, and the Inflexible. These ships were flanked by smaller destroyers on either side in loose formation. Destroyers typically sat much higher in the water than the other larger surface ships, making them safer from enemy torpedo fire, and so they were often used to screen for enemy U-boats and act as an initial defensive line for cruisers and battleships. Following the cruisers was the 12th submarine flotilla, led by the scout cruiser Fearless, which had been retrofitted into a submarine tender for the 4 K-class submarines under her command: K-4, K-3, K-6, and K-7. The Fearless was of particular note due to her dazzle camouflage, an experiment designed to make it more difficult for enemy ships to gauge her distance. Finally, there were 3 massive battleships from the 5th Battle Squadron: the Barham, the Warspite, and the Valiant, with yet more screening destroyers assigned to their defense. In total, besides the destroyers, there were 19 ships leaving the port of Rosyth that evening as the sun set. In the dark, it would be impossible for each ship to directly follow the one ahead of it without assistance, and so each shone a blue stern light behind it as they left. These lights were only shown at half luminosity and shuttered so that they could only be seen within a narrow angle behind the ship, meaning that it would be easy to lose sight of this light. The difficulty was heightened as a mist settled onto the waters around May Island, reducing visibility. Reacting to the U-boat sighting earlier that day, the commander of the force had ordered all ships to increase speed to 21 knots when entering the open ocean in order to pass through the threatened area as quickly as possible. But shortly after passing the Isle of May, the submarine directly behind the Ethereal, K-11, noticed 2 small ships in the mist ahead of it. This was curious, as the Ethereal had given no warning, and nobody had been informed of any other ships scheduled to enter the waters around the island. To the captain of K-11, it was as if they had materialized out of the mist. Despite the poor visibility and the poor maneuverability of the submarine, K-11 was able to make a wide turn to avoid the vessels easily. K-17, close behind it, noticed the maneuver and made the same wide turn to avoid an impact. K-14, however, hesitated, uncertain of why they were making an unscheduled change of course, and the captain ordered to slow the ship from 19 knots to 13 in case of an obstacle. Suddenly, he saw the 2 ships in the mist and ordered a hard turn to port. The helm responded, and K-14 swung clear of the ships, but as the helmsman was rotating the wheel, it jammed. The submarine's current trajectory would take her well clear of the 2 unknown vessels, but the helmsman was no longer in control of the rudder, and the ship was stuck turning left. The captain turned on the navigation lights and called to halt the ship as the helmsman fruitlessly attempted to free the wheel. He pushed as hard as he could, but no matter how much pressure he applied, the wheel would not move beyond 3 inches in either direction, and all the while, the ship coasted through the water, the steam engine fighting against the massive momentum of the submarine. At last, K-14 came to a stop. Time was crucial, as the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron was sure to be close behind, and if K-14 did not move, they ran the risk of being rammed by one of their number. More immediately, however, was the fear of the submarine just behind them, K-12, of inadvertently hitting them. Fortunately, K-12 also illuminated her navigation lights, and it was obvious that she would pass well clear of them. Assuming that K-22 would be following K-12, the captain busied himself with how he would clear K-14 of the battlecruisers closing on their position. 5 minutes later, as he ordered the ship ahead, the helm came free and the rudder would turn again, apparently with full control. The captain belayed his previous order and quickly decided that he would attempt to fall back in line with the rest of the submarines in the flotilla. However, one of his assumptions had proven wrong. The unlucky K-22 had been the last submarine in the line, but 5 minutes prior, their lookout had lost sight of K-12 and her stern light. K-22 had continued ahead at 19 knots in order to rediscover K-12, but had drifted far to port, and now she was on a direct course to ram K-14. Through the mist, K-22 spotted the red navigation light of K-14, and the captain ordered a hard turn to port. But the submarine was far too heavy and clumsy to make such a drastic turn. The bow of K-22 sliced into the nose of K-14, breaching the crew compartment where 2 submariners were resting. Freezing water rushed into the submarine and caught these 2 men unaware, and they were quickly sucked out into the sea and drowned as a chunk of the bow from K-14 tore free and sank. Aboard K-22, the torpedo room was breached and water began rushing into it, but the crew was able to shut the watertight door and prevent the submarine from flooding. The same occurred aboard K-14. Everyone aboard each ship was confused. The captain of K-14 was baffled as to how he had been hit when his navigation lights made him so obvious in the water, while the captain of K-22 erroneously believed that he had hit K-12, the ship he was supposed to be following. In reality, K-12 had caught up with the ship ahead of it, mistaking K-17 for K-14, and was now following the undamaged members of the 13th Submarine Flotilla out into the North Sea, none of them aware of the collision. It was quickly established that the bow of K-22 was now lodged deep into K-14, but neither ship was in immediate danger of sinking. Knowing that the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron was on its way, a submariner exited the top of K-14 and began firing flares into the air in order to warn off any other ships, while another crew member requested assistance in Morse code with a lantern. And aboard K-22, the radio operator coded a message to the Ethereal to inform them of the collision. However, this message incorrectly stated that they had hit K-12, not K-14, and even then, it would take time for the message to be decoded. Before anything else could be done, the 2 ships would have to extricate K-22 from the hull of K-14. To this end, K-22 set her engines in reverse, and the ship carefully slid her nose out of the hull of K-14 with surprising ease. Soon, K-22 was facing directly eastward. But this had taken time, and soon after K-22 had settled in the water again, the massive Australia, leading the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, passed K-22 on the port side, and close behind her were the New Zealand and the Indomitable. These 3 battlecruisers had fortunately chosen courses that took them around the submarines, only sloshing the barely buoyant ships in the water. But unbeknownst to anyone else, the final ship in the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, the Inflexible, had some time prior lost sight of the ship ahead of it in the mist and had drifted significantly off course. Hoping to gain on them again, the captain ordered the speed increased, but only a few moments after he gave the order, he saw the starboard side of K-22, motionless and damaged in the water. Desperately, he gave the order to turn to starboard. The turn made the angle shallower, but it was far too late to prevent an impact. The bow of the Inflexible scraped along the starboard side of K-22, shearing off the external ballasts and the oil tanks before steaming past. Enraged, the captain of K-22 climbed out of the conning tower, shook his fist, and shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" Ignoring the question, the Inflexible continued on insouciantly and disappeared into the mist. It quickly became clear that none of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron would be stopping to assist or assess the damage, leaving the 2 submarines to fend for themselves for the time being. In order to stay buoyant, K-22 emptied fuel and water from its tanks, coating the surface of the sea in a thin oil. Meanwhile, the Ethereal had finally managed to decode the distress call sent from K-22. At some point while relaying the message, someone had made a serious error, and it wasn't until almost 30 minutes later that the captain of the Ethereal learned of the first collision, after they had traveled 20 nautical miles away from the wreck. Acting quickly, the Ethereal made the decision to turn around and offer assistance. The captain was aware that this would potentially take the 13th Submarine Flotilla on a direct course towards the other ships exiting the Firth of Forth, and so he decided to make an extremely wide turn to starboard, surmising that if the turn was wide enough, they would pass the other ships far to the south. To reduce confusion, the Ethereal ordered the submarines to turn off their navigation lights, and out of an abundance of caution, the captain ordered a message sent to the other ships to inform them of this maneuver. However, the orders given to each group left an ambiguity. While they were to turn upon passing the Isle of May, no specific location was designated to begin this maneuver, and so each group turned at slightly different points, meaning that they were all now heading along slightly different tracks, and now the 13th Submarine Flotilla was headed directly towards the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron. Ideally, the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron would know to look for them, but despite the Ethereal's prudence, the battlecruisers were entirely unaware of the approach of the flotilla. The coding officer had been handed the message, but after he had finished coding it, he was given an addendum, and he was forced to code this as well. While he was coding this message, the cipher officer approached him and told him that the message should be sent in cipher, not code, and took both messages away to the bridge. For 30 minutes, the 13th Submarine Flotilla and the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron steamed towards each other as the messages aboard the Ethereal were shuffled, amended, recoded, and reciphered. The warning was no closer to being transmitted by the time they were upon one another. The Australia, the New Zealand, and the Indomitable were all on a collision course towards the Ethereal. The Inflexible, which had ripped the ballast and fuel tanks off of K-22, was nowhere to be found. The mist gave the Ethereal little time for evasive maneuvers. She desperately turned to starboard to avoid the line of battlecruisers, and behind her, K-11 followed. The Australia, believing that the danger had passed, carried on her course. But at the last second, they saw that two more submarines, K-17 and K-12, were headed towards them. Any maneuver that the Australia made, however, would only put the submarines into further danger, as her stern would swing wide to hit the last submarine. Therefore, it was left to the clumsy K-class submarines to evade the Australia on their own. Each of them turned hard to starboard to follow the Ethereal and her maneuver. K-17 was able to make her turn just in time, but K-12 drew right up alongside the cruiser. With only feet to spare, K-12 passed clear of the Australia. However, this maneuver placed the remainder of the 13th Submarine Flotilla into further danger. While the battlecruisers had been evaded, there was still the matter of the screening destroyers concealed in the mist. Precisely how many there were, not even all of the captains knew. The Ethereal's turn had unknowingly placed her on a collision course directly with the destroyer, and seeing her with only seconds to spare, the Ethereal swung back to starboard to avoid her, then corrected her course to carry her southwest once again to take her out of the swarm of destroyers. As she did so, another screening destroyer placed herself in the way of the Ethereal, and again, the captain ordered a hard turn to starboard. The angle and the speed seemed far too much this time for those above deck, and they braced for impact. But miraculously, the Ethereal steered out of the way, and she once again continued leading the 13th submarine flotilla through the mist. At last, they had cleared the 2nd battlecruiser squadron and its destroyers. But the 13th submarine flotilla was far from safe. The 12th submarine flotilla had made its turn much earlier than the other groups, and now the two flotillas were traveling at a shallow angle towards each other, the 12th traveling east and the 13th traveling southwest. The captain of the Ethereal believed that the 12th submarine flotilla would be aware of their presence, but the message had still not been delivered, meaning that the Fearless didn't know to look for the Ethereal or her submarines. As they approached, both submarine leaders saw that the two lines of ships would cross paths, but here the mist was lighter, and they were able to see one another with generous time to make a proper maneuver. It was clear that the Ethereal would easily pass the Fearless, but the present course could not be maintained if the K-class submarines were to avoid the Fearless and each other. Movement among naval vessels is governed by a set of rules, and one of these rules is that smaller ships are to turn to make way for larger ones, and between the Fearless and the K-class, the Fearless was the larger. Therefore, the captain of the Fearless ordered to maintain the present course. According to the rules of the sea, the K-class submarines would have to turn to starboard to make way for the Fearless and fall back in line with the Ethereal soon after. Given that there were no screening destroyers for the flotillas, this theoretically wouldn't pose a problem. However, the K-class submarines had no intention of changing course. K-11, the submarine directly behind the Ethereal, passed in front of the Fearless, closer than was comfortable. The Fearless, however, continued onward. Now, K-17 was approaching. The Fearless waited to see K-17 turn as the two drew close, refusing to alter her heading out of fear of causing even further problems by encroaching on the submarine's responsibility. The Fearless waited until a collision became inevitable. In an effort to make the angle shallower, the Fearless began to turn, but it was far too late. As sirens blared, the bow of the Fearless struck the side of K-17 and lodged into her, dragging her forward with her massive momentum. Pulled by the water, K-17 rolled off to the port side of the Fearless and tore free. For the moment, the Fearless appeared to still be buoyant, but it was immediately obvious that K-17 was hopelessly damaged. While the lurch was brutal for both ships, nobody was fatally injured, and the 56 men aboard K-17 began clambering to the top deck as the boats from the Fearless were lowered to ferry the submariners to safety. To warn her attendant submarines, the Fearless began blasting a signal over the foghorn, indicating that the ship was coming to a stop. Behind it, K-4 heard the warning alarm and set her engines into full reverse, bringing her to a halt just barely in time before hitting the Fearless. Meanwhile, K-12 from the 13th submarine flotilla was approaching the damaged ships at a rapid pace. She made a sharp turn to starboard to avoid the Fearless and K-17, which now rested in her way, and she was just barely able to clear both damaged ships and careen past the 12th submarine flotilla. Behind K-4, K-3 was closing distance. The captain was called to the bridge during his dinner, but when he arrived, he was uncertain of what precisely was happening ahead of him, with the cacophony of sirens and mess of lights. He ordered the engines to half steam as he attempted to evaluate the situation, but as K-3 neared the ships, he recognized that he was on a collision course with K-4, and what's more, he would not be able to stop his massive submarine in time with the distance remaining. The helm oversteered K-3 to port, swinging the whole ship and trying to push her momentum to the port side of K-4. Now, however, the stern of the submarine was on track to hit K-4. Deftly, the helm turned K3 back to starboard, swinging the stern out of the way just barely in time. Ordering the engines astern full, the submarine slowly began drifting to a stop just to the port side of the heavily damaged Fearless. In the meantime, K6 turned slightly starboard to pull safely clear of K12, which was still attempting to run alongside the 12th submarine flotilla. K12 then circled back to inspect the damage and offer assistance, stopping off of the port bow of K3. Now, the Fearless, K4, K12, K3, and the sinking K17 were all clustered together in the waters off of the Isle of May, with sirens blaring and lights shining bright in the mist like beacons. If the U-boat appeared now, there was no telling how many British sailors would be slaughtered. Attention was now turned to the sinking submarine. While the watertight doors of K-17 had been closed to prevent further flooding, she had taken on far too much seawater and would inevitably sink. The water continued to rise around the 56 evacuees who jumped into the icy ocean, contaminated with black oil from K-17. The lower bow of the Fearless was now only a gaping hole, having been crushed, crumpled, and torn by the impact with K-17, but the watertight doors had been sealed, and she was apparently able to remain buoyant for the time being. Likely attempting to remove itself from the tangle of ships, K4 turned 90 degrees starboard. Behind this chaos, K6 was attempting to catch up to the ship ahead of it. During K3's desperate turn and her own turn to avoid K12, K6 had lost sight of K3's stern light, but now, seeing a light through the mist, the captain ordered the helmsman to follow it, assuming that he had rediscovered K3. However, as he approached, he ascertained that it was not the stern light of K3. It was the starboard light of K4, floating motionless in the water. By the time K6 made this realization, there was no time for any action. The bow of K6 rammed straight into the side of K4, nearly shearing her in half. Immediately, K4 began to sink, dragging K6 down into the ocean with her. Just behind K6 was K7, which was still traveling at significant speed. The captain had a habit of keeping his ship farther behind the ship ahead of it than ordered, especially aboard the unmaneuverable K-class that he was newly captaining. As K7 moved through the mist to keep pace with K6, the captain suddenly realized that the ship ahead was completely and inexplicably stationary. He ordered the engines full astern, but it was obvious that this wouldn't be enough to bring her to a stop in time. The helm pulled the nose of K7 to port, with just enough space for the ship to slide alongside K6. As she did so, the bottom of the ship struck the sinking K4, but K4 was sinking so rapidly that she only scraped the top. The captain of K6 ordered the engines full astern in a desperate attempt to pry herself free, and the two halves of K4 tore apart, abruptly releasing K6, which bobbed back up to the surface. Immediately, the crew of K6 trained their lights ahead, looking for survivors, but no movement could be found on the still water. There had been no time for anyone to escape. In the meantime, many of the 56 men of K-17 were struggling to keep their heads above water as the cold stole their strength and they inadvertently gulped down the black oil, while a few still stood on the casing of their sinking submarine. By this point, the boats from the Fearless had all been deployed and were busying themselves finding submariners in the water to pull to warmth and safety. But behind this cluster of ships, there was still one final group leaving the Firth of Forth, the 5th Battle Squadron, with its 3 battleships and its myriad screening destroyers. They had passed well south of the first collision between K-14 and K-22, but even after all this time, only the first warning about the first collision had been transmitted, useless by this point, leaving the massive battleships entirely unaware that the 13th submarine flotilla had even reversed course, and now they were bearing down on the remaining ships of the 2 flotillas at a speed of 21 knots. First, the Barham approached, and it appeared that she would scrape along the port side of K3, But by incredible luck, she managed to squeeze between K3 and K12, avoiding not only the survivors of K17, but all of the ships tangled among one another. But this was not the case for the screening destroyers. Ignorant of the survivors in the water, they chose tracks around the Fearless and the sinking submarine. The rescue boats from the Fearless scattered and dodged out of the way as the destroyers carved their paths straight through the survivors. As the first destroyer passed, she slammed into the men, concussing and battering many of them, while others were sucked into the propellers and torn into pieces. The wash of the Barham swept over the sailors still standing on K-17, pushing them into the water and directly into the path of the remaining destroyers. Following close behind the Barham was the Warspite, which threaded between the ships in exactly the same way that the Barham had, but along with her came further screening destroyers who crushed yet more survivors, and finally, the Valiant passed between them with the last group of destroyers. All three battleships had been traveling so precisely that they managed to weave their ships between the submarines without even touching their hulls. The fortune of the battleships was undercut by the deadly courses of the destroyers. As they found new paths, each one struck, drowned, and dismembered even more submariners. This continued until the entire 5th Battle Squadron had passed. After they did, the sailors aboard the Fearless and the other K-class submarines searched for men in the oily, bloody water, but of the 56 who had abandoned K-17, only 10 could be found, one of whom was gravely wounded. After bringing him aboard the Fearless, this wounded man died as well, leaving only 9. At last, the waters were clear and the ships could take inventory. The Fearless herself had been horrifically damaged, but it was clear that she was in no danger of sinking despite the gaping hole in the foresection, and so she began to limp back to Rosyth alongside the remaining K-class submarines. Back at the initial collision, K-14 and K-22 were receiving assistance from some of the screening destroyers, and one of them began towing K-14 back to harbor. K-22, on the other hand, was able to travel back on her own power, but her speed was limited by the pressure placed on the door exposed to the water in the foresection. The other ships, still scheduled to meet with the force from Scapa Flow, continued onward into the North Sea, leaving the carnage of the submarine flotillas behind them. After an hour and 15 minutes, the Battle of May Island was finished. Immediately upon the return of the damaged ships, the admirals began communicating, desperate to discover what precisely had happened. Many of the details were muddled and contradictory. Only a few things could be discerned for certain. Of the 9 K-class submarines that had left the Firth of Forth that night, 2 had sunk and 3 had been damaged to varying degrees, a casualty rate of over 50%. The Fearless had suffered crippling damage to her hull, while the Inflexible had lived up to her name and escaped with only scrapes. From the initial impact between K-14 and K-22, 2 men had drowned when water flooded into the living quarters. When K-6 had bisected K-4, every one of the 55 men aboard went down with the ship, and of the 56 who escaped from K-17, 47 of them have been smashed and shredded by the screening destroyers. No survivors were discovered after the event, and the vast majority of the corpses were lost at sea. The final death toll for the Battle of May Island was 104. The admirals agreed this matter had to be resolved both quickly and discreetly. After only 4 days, the court-martial began to determine who and what precisely was at fault. Despite the overwhelming complexity of the Battle of May Island and the myriad of conflicting reports, a basic timeline of what occurred could be ascertained, though the specific routes of certain ships remained in dispute. In particular, the inciting incident for the entire event was confounding. First, what were the 2 boats that had found themselves in the path of the 13th submarine flotilla, floating in the mist? Nobody with the force leaving Rosyth was informed about other ships scheduled to be in the water, and they were far too small to be enemy vessels. The immediate suspicion was that they were minesweepers, but when the man coordinating the ships at the Isle of May was brought to testify, his statements didn't align with the experiences of the 13th Submarine Flotilla. He confirmed that, while there were small ships out sweeping for mines at the time, they theoretically wouldn't have crossed paths with the ships from Rosyth. Even more mysterious, however, was the mechanical failure experienced by K-14, namely, the jamming of her helm. While the K-class was prone to sometimes extreme issues related to their construction and maintenance, there had never been a cataloged incident with the helm jamming, and nobody serving aboard the K-class ever made mention of such an incident. A thorough investigation of every mechanism from the helm to the rudder was performed, and yet, every single test came back with the same result. As things were, no cause could be found for the jam, and it could not be replicated. In the end, while a few of the officers were reprimanded, this had little to no effect on their careers, and the reason seemed clear. The event had been so embarrassing for the British Royal Navy that the Admiralty was more interested in hiding it than remedying it. No memorial was to be constructed, and no record was to be made public. To the submariners who partook in the Battle of May Island, the moral was clear. The K-class was far too awkward and unreliable, communication technology was too rudimentary to properly coordinate with the fleet, and fleet submarines were more of a danger to their own ships than to any enemy. But to the admirals, the problem lay not with the K-class, nor with the concept of fleet submarines, only in their implementation. The performance of these large submarines after the war, however, did not bear out the expectations of the admirals. They never were to encounter the enemy beyond the one fruitless exchange of fire, and after a formal declaration of peace between the belligerents in the Great War, the K-class were assigned to posts around the Atlantic. There, however, they continued to suffer mechanical faults, and dozens of the Grand Fleet's best mariners drowned as K-class continued to sink. Even still, the admirals were keen to make use of this submarine that was meant to be one of the great achievements of the Royal Navy. As such, a few of the K-class were retrofitted to have massive 12-inch guns mounted onto the deck, recategorizing them as the M-class. This extra gun, however, made the already clumsy ships even more unwieldy. On December 12, 1925, M1 dove during an exercise and simply never resurfaced, drowning all 60 men aboard. After so many deaths due to the inadequacy of the submarines, the Royal Navy was finally forced to retire the remaining K-class, sending the majority of them in for scrap. The M-class, however, were retrofitted for new purposes. M2 was outfitted with a hangar to launch a single biplane with folding wings, while M3 was given a mine layer. But these alterations couldn't solve the extant issues with the hull. One day, while out at sea, M2 seemed to disappear entirely. Only hours later, a man aboard a ship who had seen M2 that morning casually asked if it was normal for submarines to dive backwards. He was told that it was not. It took 8 days for the search teams to discover M2 in over 100 feet of water. Her crew had all suffocated in the time it took the salvage crews to find her. It was decided that M3 would not be given the chance to drown her crew as well, and she was scrapped for her metal. The last of the K-class hulls had finally disappeared, and with them, the dream of the fleet submarine. It would be decades until the creation of another submarine that rivaled the size of the K-class, and this time, when they did, they were running under nuclear power, and their implementation would not even slightly resemble that of the K-class. Even after the war, as the files of military operations were made public, those kept about the Battle of May Island remained sealed, and the Royal Navy seemed willing only to acknowledge the most basic facts about it. It wasn't until 1994, 76 years later, that the file was released and the details made public, and in 2002, a memorial was finally constructed in Anstruther Harbor, long after everyone involved had died of old age. Now, every trace of the K-class has either been dismantled or rests on the bottom of the ocean, rusting and decaying, a fate that, to those who served aboard them, would seem only fitting.
Convicts, let fire light the way. Deep in the darkness, hawks reside. Silence, silence. No deception comes from the King's command. In the mist, in the distance, in the darkness, in distress. Deep in the mist, silence. Hold deep under pressure, life's fragile strand. Surrender. High overhead, life is Deep in the darkness, hawks reside. Deep in the mist, silence holds peace. Conviction worn away under waves disregarded.